On the last podcast, we talked about net operating income and the ratio between net operating income and gross revenue, which is mainly a way to determine if your winery is operating efficiently. So now we're going to go into revenue, and your main two types of revenue, or main revenue, is going to come from wine sales, which has a wholesale method or a retail method, or both. You could be selling to wholesale distributors, or hopefully out of your tasting room. If you don't have a tasting room and you have a winery, you're doing something wrong. But let's assume you have a tasting room and you're selling retail, and you're probably selling wholesale. My personal opinion is don't sell wholesale, and I'll get to that. But let's discuss the wholesale method of selling wine. So a wholesale method is you have multiple distributors. Different states or regions have distributors, and you have a contract with them to sell your wine. So the wholesaler will go out to, stores, but mainly restaurants, and have a list of a whole bunch of wineries that they give to the restaurant, and the restaurant looks down the list and says, okay, I want to order this and this and this and this and this and blah, 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 blah. And your wine is just going to be one of those multiple wineries on that list that the distributor is promoting. And what makes a distributor promote your wine over another wine? Really nothing. The only way that they do that is if you lower your price to the distributor so that they can go sell the wine at a lower price to the restaurants. The restaurant wants to build in as much profit as possible, obviously. So when they look down their distribution's list of things available, they're going to look for the cheapest one, unless they're a very high-end restaurant and know that their customers can recognize brands of wine, which is pretty rare. For the most part, they're going to say, I want to put in some Chardonnay in my restaurant this week or this month, and what's the cheapest Chardonnay? And I'm going to put in some Zin. What's the cheapest Zin? That's how most restaurants, because most restaurants are profit oriented, they're trying to find the cheapest wine they can to mark it up and make money. So if they buy a case for $144 and you're selling your case for $132, they're going to take the $132 case, because the reality is it's Chardonnay. What's the difference between Chardonnay? Most people can't tell the difference between one Chardonnay and another. Now, again, if you're going to a high-end steakhouse, they may say, we definitely want this brand because it's recognizable to our customers and we want to have that for them. I'm probably not talking to you as a winery owner. Those are the big boys out there, and we don't necessarily want to compete with those people. Maybe you do, but I would not advise that. So anyway, you go to your wholesaler, and the only way your wholesaler is ever going to promote your wine over another wine is if you cut price below what is the standard price for a case of wine. So for the most part, you're competing against all these other, mid-sized wineries that are all trying to push their wine to a wholesaler who's out there selling the cheapest wine and really not helping you as a winery owner much at all. So that's the wholesale process. And a lot of wineries do that because they don't know a whole lot about how to sell their wine. So they have this wholesale process and they have a retail process. Again, the retail process being the tasting room. There are other ways to sell wholesale wine, and I'm going to get into that, but that's the most standard way of a wholesale winery process. So for the retail wine, you're kind of looking at your tasting room, but there are some other ways of doing retail sales. But your tasting room is where you're going to sell most of your wine retail. But the main question you have is not so much, do I sell my wine wholesale or do I sell my wine retail? The question you need to be asking is, who is my customer? If you think that the customer is the restaurant or the wholesaler, then you're missing the whole point of selling wine. Your customer is the person who drinks the wine. That would be the end user. And how do you get to the end user as selling wholesale? Well, the reality is that the restaurant is the one that's taking your end user. So in the wholesale model of sales, you sell your wine for a cheap rate to a wholesaler who then goes and sells it to a restaurant. The end user, the customer at the restaurant, is out having dinner some night and says, I want a bottle of wine and and they somehow manage to order a glass of one of your Cabernet Sauvignons, right? Now, do they associate that wine, even if they love it, do they associate it with your winery? More often than not, no. They have no clue who this winery is or who made this wine or anything. They will associate that experience with the restaurant, and they'll leave the restaurant going, that was a wonderful dinner and the wine was excellent. I mean, maybe 1 in 100 times the person will actually ask their waiter, because most restaurants don't have their own sommelier, but they'll ask their waiter, hey, what wine was I drinking? And, I'm sure you've been to restaurants and you've asked that question to a waiter, and the waiter's like, I don't have any idea. I have to go look. And I mean, they just don't know. They're not selling your wine. They're selling their restaurant experience, because let's face it, they're an employee of the restaurant. They want the customer to have a good experience with the food, the ambiance, and the wine. It's all part of the customer's experience at a restaurant. It's not about solely the wine. So you're losing your end user, your customer, to the restaurant when you sell your wine wholesale. I remember meeting with a new winery owner. They were pretty small, probably considered micro. I don't think they had more than $250,000 in sales, but they were meeting with me to go over, how do I determine what to do for wholesale wine? The same questions every winery owner asks. And I said, well, who's your customer? And of course they're like, well, I think this restaurant gets our wine, and I think we're in Bevmo and blah, and it's like they had no idea who their customer was. And from my days in venture capital, if you can't identify your customer, you're not going to be successful. So when you are a winery, the customer is the person drinking your wine. Period. It's not a restaurant. It's not the wholesaler. It's not a store. It is the person who's drinking your wine. And this is why I don't like wholesale distribution, is because you have no control over who your customer is. You don't even know who your customers are, because you don't know who is at the restaurant ordering your wine. So the restaurant or the store is getting the advantage of your customer. And as a winery owner, you need to get that back, which means you've got to figure out a different way of doing wholesale. And I would say it's not through a wholesale distributor. And again, these are some things I'm going to tell you how to do, but let's just stop with this process and say the main question we need to ask ourselves is, who is the actual customer of a winery? And if you've gotten to this point, you would say, I guess it's the person who's drinking the wine. Correct. That's who your customer is. So then the next question should be, how do I sell my wine to that customer? And knowing who your customer is the next big question. But a retail tasting room is probably the best way to actually sell your wine to the actual customer. They come in the door, they taste your wine, you have a salesperson who's talking directly to them. So a tasting room retail model is going to put you and your winery and your wine in direct contact with the actual drinker of that wine, and is a much better way to get a loyal customer in the long run. So again, I would, if you're asking me and you're a winery owner, should I sell my wine to blah, 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 wholesale distributor? They have, 100,000 restaurants I'd be like, who cares? You do not control the wine drinker at that point in time. You're giving away your customers to somebody else. So don't do it that way. I think it's a complete waste of time. If you're a huge winery and you have a recognizable brand name, then that's fine, because you have control of your brand. But there are very few wineries that have that kind of brand recognition across the country where, they are looking to order that specific wine when they're in a restaurant or they go into a store. It's just very, very few. So you're better off controlling the end user customer by selling at retail, or coming up with different creative ways of doing wholesale wine sales. So in terms of retail, some of the ways you have to sell retail are obviously through the tasting room, but another great one is through a wine club. Now, you're really not going to get wine club members unless you have a tasting room. So wine club really is just an extension of your tasting room. So in that sense, a wine club is basically a grouping of your loyal customers, people who want to buy your wine over and over and over again. And I can't say enough about wine clubs. You should have a wine club. There are different strategies about how frequently you send stuff to your wine club, and I have some ideas about that. But your wine club is basically a loyal customer list, and you want to treat them right. But I think that I'm going to go back to some other concepts here, but one way that winery owners tend to think about increasing sales is through increasing price. And it's really not necessarily about that. The winery that I worked for, the manager told a story about a different winery that said the whole winery business is a game of boxes, and it really is. It's about how many cases of wine are you going to make, are you going to bottle, and how many are you going to sell. It's a game of moving boxes from one place to the other, and someone's drinking them. But he was more referring to the wholesale method, and I would say it's more about the retail method of moving boxes from, bottling to getting them to your customers. And in a lot of cases, the winery owner would say that, price is the best way to generate higher sales. Really, you could say, okay, how many, you could have kind of a supply and demand graph. In other words, you could say, if I bottled only 1,000 bottles and I sell them for $100 each, is that going to give me my equilibrium of total bottles and price? And yeah, you're going to get some number out of that. And vice versa, you could sell the bottles for $5 and bottle a ton of them, and you're going to get another sales dollar. But you're really trying to find the equilibrium of what is a good price for my wine that's going to maximize the number of sales dollars. In other words, it could be like, I need to bottle 5,000 bottles and sell it at $20 a bottle. That's going to maximize my revenue. And if I go to $25 a bottle, I'm only going to sell, 800 bottles or whatever. So you're trying to find that equilibrium of price and total number of bottles. And a lot of that's going to be experimentation of pricing and knowing your customers and things like that. But it just saying, I'm going to raise prices on my wine is really not the best way to go unless you know that your customers are willing to pay more for that wine. I think a story I always liked was, I worked in the Monterey area, and there were a lot of small wineries out there. I mean, maybe did $1 million in revenue. But one winery didn't do any wholesale, but they would sell their bottles at their tasting room for like $60, $70. And there was this perception from the wine drinker that a $60 or $70 bottle of wine must be, a great bottle of wine. It must be a 95, and it just wasn't. But it had that perception that because it costs more, it was a better bottle of wine. And they might sell, a couple bottles to people that were, doing tasting room visits or whatever. But was it an effective method of generating the most revenue possible? Probably not, because a lot of people aren't going to buy an average wine for $70. They can get average tasting wine just about anywhere for $10. Again, it kind of comes to this point of, you've got to figure out that equilibrium of how many bottles can I sell and at what price, and what's going to generate the most revenue for me. Not necessarily I'm just going to raise price, or I'm going to bottle 5,000 cases regardless of whether I can sell them. And again, there's the old saying, you don't want to discount a premium product. So if you feel like you have a premium wine and you're bottling too much, you're basically discounting what is a premium product. And people are never going to pay the premium price if they know that it's going to get discounted at some point in time or another. So there's this equilibrium of total bottles that I should be, bottling versus the sales price I'm charging. And you don't want to deviate from that. It's going to take some time to figure that out. Shouldn't take too much time, but might take some experimentation on pricing and how that works. And again, another example of the winery I worked for, they had high-end wine, a reserve that was $60 a bottle. Probably worth $60 a bottle, but most people don't want to spend $60 a bottle. And then they had a red blend, which was really good. But most winemakers think a red blend is, the dregs of winemaking. So they would sell this red blend for like $15 a bottle. But it tasted as good as a lot of other more expensive wines. And so the $15 sold out like crazy. They were selling tons and tons of this red blend and very little of their actual varietals. A friend of mine, a friend of mine and I, he worked there with me. We got together and said we should change the price of this red blend. It's very popular, and it's cannibalizing the sales of our actual varietals, which we're selling for about 24, 25, $28, somewhere between 24 and 30. So we priced the red blend at $20 and lowered all of the other varietals, the standards, down to about $25. So there's a $5 difference between the blend, which is generally considered not to be as good as, a cab or a Zin or whatever. It was a red blend. And it was amazing. We still sold a lot of the blend, but we started seeing higher sales of our Zins and our cabs because the price point became so close that it's like, well, if I'm going to have some guests over, I don't want to serve them a red blend. I'm happy to have a red blend when I'm having wine on my own for dinner. But if I have guests over, I want to give them, a cab that costs $25. And so we saw a lot higher sales of the regular varietals, and we did not see a drop off of the red blend at all. So we maximized our sales by increasing the price of the red blend, but decreasing the price of the varietals. And that was kind of our testing, like, how are we going to find this equilibrium? We kept the reserve at the high price because that was, expected of a very low run reserve, and it was very good. But again, there's not that many people out there that are going to go splurge on a $60, $70 bottle of wine because they just don't know if it's that good or not. The customer tends to not be able to differentiate between a 93 and an 87. There are people that can, but for the most part they can't. So, there's the again, the aspect of how do I determine this equilibrium of price and number of bottles that I'm putting out there. So the next podcast, we'll talk a little bit about how to actually identify who your customer is. In this case, we discussed finding that customer, and we, again, wholesale versus retail. I would say your customer is the person drinking the wine. So in the next podcast, we'll talk about how do you actually sell to that particular customer. Thanks.